the Cuban Missile Crisis, when tomorrow wasn't a guarantee, but a privilege. The United States and the Soviet Union were on the brink of nuclear war, and tensions couldn't be higher. It seemed like conflict was well on its way, but through compromise, the most potentially destructive war in human history was avoided. The Cold War, starting in 1947, reached a climax during a 13-day period of conflict on October 16, 1962, to October 28, 1962, known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States went into DEFCON 2 for the only time in its history, but the USSR and the USA were able to reach successful compromise that removed missiles from Cuba, Italy, and Turkey, and led to the limited nuclear test ban just a year later. Subsequent to World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were the superpowers of the world. They had been allies during the war, but once their common enemy had been defeated, their glaring differences started to become more and more unavoidable. This era of geopolitical tension started around 1947 and did not end until the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 25, 1991. This Cold War was a war of ideas and culture, and both nations used everything from movies to sporting events to attempt to spread their influence and become the one dominant force on the globe. However, violence was never completely out of the question, and on October 16th through 28th, 1962, this was made very clear. Fidel Castro came into power as the dictator of Cuba in 1959, and the United States was not very happy with his power change. The country was becoming increasingly communist, so in an attempt to overthrow Castro, they launched the unsuccessful Bay of Pigs invasion on April 17th through 19th of 1961. When CIA-sponsored paramilitary group Brigade 2506, as well as 8 CIA-supplied B-26 bombers and 5 supply ships were sent to invade Cuba through the Bay of Pigs. Throughout the course of the invasion, there were about 1,600 total casualties, with over 1,000 soldiers captured and over 100 killed, in addition to the loss of 2 bombers and 2 supply ships. This allowed Castro to ask Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev for help. Khrushchev happily complied, and the USSR started secretly deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba. This act was done to protect the island as much as it was to counteract American nuclear-tipped Jupiter missiles in Italy and Turkey. The Jupiter missiles, which had been started being deployed in 1959, were America's first nuclear medium-range ballistic missiles. On October 16, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane secretly photographed missile sites being built by the Soviet Union in Cuba. Understandably, the United States really didn't like the idea of a communist country supported by the USSR having possession of nuclear missiles so close to the country. Some of John F. Kennedy's advisors suggested bombing Cuba, but after several days of secret meetings and discussion, the U.S. decided to put a naval quarantine around Cuba to prevent them from bringing in any more military supplies from the USSR, in addition to ordering the U.S. Armed Forces to DEFCON 3 on October 22nd. The United States refrained from calling it a blockade, as a blockade would be considered an act of war. They demanded the removal of the missiles and dismantlement of the sites. The Soviet and Cuban governments insisted the missiles were only defensive and weren't looking to get rid of them anytime soon. Khrushchev thought of the quarantine as an act of aggression and was outraged by the move. On October 24th, the Strategic Air Command was ordered to DEFCON 2, one step away from nuclear war. This was the first time DEFCON 2 had ever been reached, and there has still been only one other time to date that the United States has been put into DEFCON 2. On October 27, 1962, a United States spy plane piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson was shot down by a Soviet missile over Cuba. This made him the only person killed by enemy fire throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis. On the same day, a Soviet submarine was spotted off the coast of Cuba. It would not be known by the U.S. until over 50 years later at the 50th reunion of the crisis, but the submarine was armed with a nuclear torpedo. An American Navy vessel dropped a couple small depth charges near the sub to signal it to come up. Kennedy himself was nervous about the use of death charges, as he knew that the use of the charges could easily be taken the wrong way. The submarine shook with each detonation, and the temperature inside rose to over 100 degrees as the air conditioning broke down. There was a lot of panic in the sub, and the captain ordered the missile to be ready. He and several others thought they were being attacked and that the surfacing would doom them. The 3 senior officers on the sub had to all agree on the decision to launch the missile, and 2 officers supported the launch, but Vasily Arkhipov, a flotilla commander responsible for 3 Soviet submarines on their secret mission to Cuba, refused to fire the missile. He thought that if it was really an attack, the United States ship would have dropped the depth charges directly on the sub. He proposed that the charges were merely a signal to surface and identify themselves. They were too deep to communicate with anybody on the surface, so they were left with no choice other than to resist firing the missile. The sub rose to the surface and met with the U.S. destroyer. The Americans didn't board, and there were no inspections. The sub just turned away and headed back towards Russia. In Washington, D.C., Attorney General Robert Kennedy secretly met with Russian Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin to negotiate a possible end to the tension and reach an agreement. Kennedy revealed that the United States was planning to get rid of most of the Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy anyway in the upcoming months, as they were quickly becoming obsolete and were susceptible to Soviet attacks. After intense negotiations, they reached a proposal. The Soviet Union agreed to withdraw all missiles and supplies from Cuba under UN inspection as long as the United States promised to never invade Cuba again and dismantle their missiles in Turkey and Italy. Dobrynin contacted Moscow and urged Khrushchev to accept the offer. At 9:00 a.m. the next day, Khrushchev announced that the USSR would remove all of their missiles from Cuba. The US complied with the request to remove their missiles, and the crisis was officially over. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev wanted to do whatever they could to avoid nuclear war, and they were able to achieve that goal, saving anywhere from hundreds of thousands to hundreds of millions of lives. The immediate reaction to the agreement by the public in both countries was not very positive, and many were irritated that their country was willing to negotiate with an enemy. But once the dust settled, the overwhelming positive impact of the deal became clear to most. When all offensive missiles and light bombers had been withdrawn from Cuba, the blockade was formally ended on November 21st, 1962. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, many people thought that something had to be done about the nuclear stockpiles of Russia and America. This, in large part, led to the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, signed on August 5, 1963, by America, Great Britain, and the USSR, preventing the testing of nuclear weapons in outer space, underwater, or in the atmosphere. The negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union pointed out the necessity of a quick, clear, and direct communication line between Washington and Moscow. As a result, the Moscow-Washington hotline was established. The crisis also helped inspire the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, signed on July 1st of 1968, which is adhered to by more countries than any other arms limitation and disarmament agreement, with 191 states adhering to the treaty. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a prime example of conflict and compromise in history. The Cold War was a conflict between the two very different ways of thinking held by the two most powerful nations in the world. But things were very close to escalating far past ideas alone. The Cuban Missile Crisis drew the two superpowers ever closer to war, but they were able to reach a compromise that avoided any military conflict. Kennedy knew that sacrificing the missiles in Turkey and Italy was worth knowing that no nuclear missile strike from Cuba could be possible. He was able to sacrifice some of his country's power for the betterment of the world, and Khrushchev was able to be patient and not overreact to America's demands by rushing into war. The Cuban Missile Crisis shows how small sacrifices could save millions of lives and go so far as to prevent war.